Okay, let's go ahead and get set up. We'll talk about where we are in the semester. I posted a new assignment. We should have 3 assignments left. I think I'm pretty much caught up on grading for everyone. Everyone got their midterm back, right? You got your, what was it, the Flexbox Frog and the garden one for grid? Okay, so everyone's set? Okay. So I posted a new assignment here. This is number 6. It'll make sense today, but number 6, the basic idea is that you're going to be using Bootstrap, which we'll talk about more. Bootstrap is weird. You probably already noticed this, that there's a lot of code, but there's a lot more copy and paste. So you're going to be copying and pasting a lot of code that you don't necessarily understand, but it's like copy, paste, modify. So like you'll have these, and there's a lot of it's based on class names. So you might have something like that's BG dark, and like just by intuition, you're like, okay, well, this has got a dark background. So if I want to make a light background, I might just do BG light. And so it's like stuff like that. It's pretty intuitive and easy to work with. So we got assignment number 6. I made this due on kind of a strange date. You know how normally I make these due on Tuesday? Mm-hmm. I pushed back the date a couple of days just so you'd have a little bit more time.
Cool.
So you'll have a week and a couple days, and then the next assignment after that will be WordPress. And WordPress that'll just, for most people, I think that'll just be like a relatively simple assignment. There's no coding at all. It's just it's very easy. There's no coding. It's just like click, 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 click. You know, make some pages. So that should be a grade booster for a lot of people. And then finally, the last thing you're going to do, the very last, is to take basically this assignment and then make your own WordPress template. Or I call it template. The official term that WordPress uses is theme. And the basic idea is most people, when they use WordPress, they'll just use some sort of theme or template that somebody else created. Yeah. A huge majority of people, that's what I end up seeing. And I want to kind of get you to the point where you can make your own. That way, you're not dependent on others. Because I've just seen a lot of people waste a lot of time with, how many people have worked with WordPress before? Show hands. So have you ever run across like a really difficult to work with theme that you just can't, it just doesn't, yeah. And so the idea is, that was nods for those that didn't see, nods of yes. And that's happened. I've seen that happen a bunch of times. And so it's like, rather than having to deal with somebody else's theme, you can now make your own. Okay. Now I will warn you, there's a little bit of coding, but this obviously I've already mentioned a few times. I'm not expecting anybody to do any coding in here. It's going to be more copy, paste, modify. So it's WordPress is in PHP. So what'll happen is like the page will have a header, and there'll be like just a little chunk of PHP code, and I'll say, hey, take this code that I've given you, and wherever you want to put your header, put this PHP code right there. So there's technically coding, but you get the idea. It's just copy and paste coding. You're not actually going to really understand what any of it's doing. Okay, so let's jump right into this. Any questions before we get started?
So I'm thinking one of the examples we're doing in class today will be similar to assignment 6 there.
Correct, yeah. So today what I want to do is start off with just a quick review. Last time we covered container and grid, so that'll be the first example we do. Then I want to get into something called, what are called utility classes, explain what those are. If you've never heard of it, we'll talk about that. And then creating a nav bar at the top, and then taking that information, so being able to take our grid system, cards, the container, and navigation, and put that all together into a site that's kind of like the Audubon Society site. Now I'm just saying this just and you just kind of skip past this first page, because this would be a little bit more than we've learned in this. It actually wouldn't be super complicated. this is actually just a large background image, a full screen background image. We're going to learn how to do this navigation today. This is, it just looks like an absolute position div. So it wouldn't be crazy, but it's just more than we have time for. But so create something like this. And you can actually even simplify this even more. You can have like a logo and navigation. You don't even have to have a 2-row navigation. And then a bunch of these cards, which we've actually already kind of done. And then the one thing I'm asking you to do that's kind of a little bit outside the box that we haven't done before is like this 2/3, 1/3 thing here. And remember we talked about the grid system. So have this take up 8 and have this take up 4. And then rather than having the image on the top, maybe the image on the bottom. So you're not going too far outside of the box. It's just like maybe a couple feet outside the box of what we're going to do in class. And then obviously you can choose to duplicate their site, and you don't have to get into this. This is probably more than. And then I would like some sort of footer. Doesn't have to be this complex, but maybe just like a single row of content. Okay. But we'll talk about it more as we get to the assignment. But that's all this is. This is just kind of the more verbose version of saying duplicate some of the things on the Audubon Society site. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So let's make a folder for today. Trust me, I know a lot of you are seniors in here and you're just like ready to graduate. So today is the 29th. I'm trying not to make your lives too difficult, but this is one of those classes that at the time you probably don't really, let me think of a nice way to say this. It might not be like your first priority, especially for those of you that are in the program for other things, like you care more about like, you know, whatever your preference is. But this will be one of those things that once you get out into the workforce and you need to make extra cash and you're like, hey, I took that web class, I learned how to use WordPress, I learned how to do Bootstrap. Somebody's asking for a website, they're going to pay me a few $100. I've got the time, you know, so. Okay, so we've created our folder. Let's go ahead and open up brackets. And I did try to make everyone's life a little bit easier under links. I gave you a link to the, remember how we were using HTML shell before? Yeah. They don't really have anything specific to Bootstrap, so here's one that's specific to Bootstrap. If you just scroll all the way down to the starter template, you can just, I think they actually have a copy button. Let's see if this actually works. ex1.html. And they give you some extra stuff we don't actually really care about. So you can get rid of this. This probably seems strange that they're putting the scripts here. The reason that they do this is because like you're probably used to these scripts being in the head section, I think, for the most part, right, when you took Professor Gibson's course. Yeah. The reason that they put these at the bottom is the way and the order that the page loads is that by putting these at the bottom, it's kind of like in a more efficient way of doing it. Don't look into it too deeply. I just don't want you to get confused that you can actually put this in the head section, but let's just leave it alone. Let's just keep our lives easy. It has to do with the, I think, did you guys cover the DOM, the document object model? Yeah. It has to do with the DOM loading, that when these scripts load at the end here, it's kind of like the DOM's had a chance to load a little bit. So anyway. Okay. So is everyone at this point? There's not really anything to look at this point, but you've got your example 1. If we go ahead and preview it, it's just going to show a blank page. And I'll try to go slow because I know with I only have really 3 examples planned today. Actually, might just merge down to 2 examples. But I want to try to go slow when I don't lose anybody, because with Bootstrap, there's just a lot of code. It's going to be a lot of copy and paste, but there's just a lot of code. Okay, so the W3 school site on Bootstrap, if you can find it. So not this. So this is the main Bootstrap site. It's called getbootstrap.com. But this W3schools Bootstrap, this one has pretty much everything we want. Just to very quickly let you know, one of the cool things that they do on this site is because they know that, like, you're not going to learn this framework in and out. Very few people do. I don't even know the whole thing in and out. What I use 90% of the time, I use this examples, and then I find that, you know, whatever I'm looking for, and then modify it as needed. And what they do is they have a bunch of examples here. Say, for example, we talked about a grid. And they just have a bunch of examples. And then once you find the example you like, unfortunately, I don't think there's a nicer way than just viewing the source. But then once you find the example, say I want to do something here with 2 columns, I just view page source, look for 2 columns. And then there we go. So we've got our 2 columns that we can copy and paste and use as needed. But we're not gonna do that too much, because that whole process it just doesn't demo well for class. You might use it on your assignment if you find something cool that you want to add. But the W3 schools site has much easier copy paste type stuff, so we'll stick with this. It's not as complete, but they still have a lot. I mean, there's a pretty good amount here. So last class we went over the history of Bootstrap and why it's needed. It's nice because it essentially allows your site to be consistent. You don't have a million different colors. You don't have a million different pixel values and breakpoints and this and that. It's very, very consistent. They kind of give you a set of things to work with. By default, our styling and our theming and all that, we're just going to take the default, but you can actually change these. And what's nice is that you don't actually specify colors so much. What you do is you specify like purpose. So what I mean is, like, the default, I actually think W3 schools, it's very possible they're actually using Bootstrap. So what you might do is say, okay, normally, I don't want to say that, okay, this button's going to be blue. I'm going to say that this is going to be like primary, meaning that it's like important. It's where you want to focus your eyes on the page. And so what I'd say is that this is primary. And by default, that's going to be blue. But then what I can go do is go back and say, okay, well, as W3 schools did, said, okay, I don't want this class primary to be blue. I want it to be green. And then you just have to change it in one spot. So there's different ways to theme these. We're just going to take the default theme because we only have so much time, but it'd probably take at least a full class to show you how to theme this. But once you leave this class, it's one of those things that you could probably just dedicate a couple days to learning. It's not super difficult. Okay, so we started off with, not sure where it is. Let's see if we can find it. Okay. So remember we talked about this idea of the container? And the whole idea of container was anything that you wrap in container is nice because it automatically becomes responsive. It automatically handles the breakpoints properly. We don't have to do our own separate media queries. It just works. So it's great. Now we have 2 types of containers. We have our main container. You remember or just the one called container? It had those hard breakpoints. Like we would move, and then kind of jump over. And that's kind of what we've been doing. They have another version called Fluid. I personally don't use Fluid that often, but if you've got a lot of content on your page, like you're an Amazon or a W3 schools, it might make sense to actually use Fluid because it gives you kind of like, it gives you a tiny little bit of extra space to work with. So to me, this looks like they used Fluid. But anyway. But in this class, we'll mainly stick to container. And then we talked about this grid system. And we have a row. Now, a row doesn't necessarily equal just to one row. That probably seems a little bit weird. So we talked about how I might have, and it's based on 12. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to scroll down to, they have a whole section on grid, because grid is important enough that it's got its own section. And so what happens is we've got a grid system that's based on 12 columns. And 12 is just a convenient number because it sets us up for like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So it sets us up for thirds or halves or quarters. And so it sets us up pretty nicely. And the idea is that when I have some sort of thing, let's say a div or a card, remember we talked about cards, and I want it to take up 1/3 of the page, all I have to do is say, hey, this card is going to span 4 columns. And it becomes very convenient because you can do equally spaced things. You can do something that takes up like 1/3 of the page, 2/3 of the page. So in this case right here, if I were working with a 12-column system, maybe my eyes are bad. That looks like a 2/3, 1/3 setup, right? Or is that 3/4, 1/4?
No, that would probably be 2/3.
2/3 and a third. Okay. So if I've got this 12-column system, how many columns would this span? 8. Perfect. And then that would leave how many left over for this?
4 columns.
Yeah. So we have 4, 4, and 8, and so it becomes very convenient to do things like this. And then we had this system where we have the word call, and then some size, and then some number. And then the basic idea was that we're specifying a column, and we're saying at this point and larger, so let's say, for example, call MD for medium, at medium-sized devices and larger, so medium, large, and extra large, I'm going to have some certain behavior. So in this case, I might say call MD8, which means that it's going to span 8 columns. And then we took that information, and then we had our cards. And we had this right here as an example, and then we made just a very basic system, okay? So let's do that. Let's recreate that example we did last class. So right now we've got this, we've got it all set up, and now we can start adding code. So the very first thing that we're going to need to do is we know we're going to need a container. So let's just add that. So say class equals container, and I think I sort of mentioned this last time, but that's the reason I use this word container, is because container is very generic, just like a div, and it's just saying it's just holding some content, and it's nice because then with that container class we can do other cool things like breakpoints and make it behave properly on various device sizes and so on. Now if I want to use the grid system, say div class is equal to, this is going to be a row. Now a row is just kind of like a logical idea of a row. Because say, for example, I have 4 cards. And on a desktop, those 4 cards all display on one single row. But then, say, for example, on a tablet, I want it to be like each one takes up half. So like half, half. And then what will happen is that it'll wrap around and then half, half. But it's still just going to be in this one row class. So it automatically wraps around. As soon as it exceeds the number 12, it automatically wraps around for you. So many times you're just going to have like 1 or 2 of these row classes that represent many things. So if we go back to the Audubon Society example, realistically, this may be one single row. these two things right here? Probably not, though. I don't know. It's hard to say without looking at the source code, but it's possible that you could do that. But anyway, but you get the basic idea. One row doesn't actually visually necessarily mean one row. It could wrap around to the next line as it exceeds spanning 12 columns. Okay, so we've got that there. Now let's go back over to our card. And so I'm over here on W3schools. And under Bootstrap 4 tutorial, scroll down to cards. And let's just take this version here with the image. Now we're going to cheat a little bit because last time we used that specific image. But let's just use, I think it's, I can't remember what it's called, Pixum.photos. I think that's it. I always type in Lorem Ipsum images. Yeah, I like the first one's always, it's been giving me trouble lately. Yeah, so this one's pretty decent. And we'll just stick to a square image is fine. So right here for image source, rather than the avatar, and we'll probably need to make it larger. So let's say 500. Now, I don't necessarily like having these fixed widths on these cards like this. It's just kind of like expand to how much you need. So just get rid of that. So under this class equals card, get rid of that style equals 400 pixels. We can preview it. You know, it shows up something, so that's good. But now if we want to actually make this into work with grid, and medium seems to be a pretty good breakpoint for me. Medium, I think, represents like the equivalent of like tablets, maybe. Maybe they specify that here somewhere. It just goes by pixel size. I think medium would represent like very large phones and smaller tablets. So to me, that's a pretty good breakpoint. And then there's small and extra small, which I think represents most phones. And so what we'll do here is we'll say that, okay, so this is going to be a part of the grid system. It's call. And then on medium and larger, let's do 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So that would be 4 columns, spanning 4 columns, spanning 4 columns. Now again, there's lots of copying and pasting, but if just kind of looking at this as a quick example, I'm going to get rid of the alt text, which is kind of, it's a bad thing to do, but I want to make this a little bit more readable. In the real world, you wouldn't get rid of it. I just want to make this a little bit more readable. Put it at the bottom. What would common sense say that you change that class name to? So it's card image top. We'd probably even exactly, yeah. And then you might actually have to physically relocate it as well, but you get the idea. You might not. Let's just try it just to see. Sometimes the way this stuff works is that the way the positioning is. Yeah, you probably actually would have to relocate it, but that's fine. So we'll leave it top for now. And if you're ever curious, yeah. Do they have an example with card and bottom? Okay. So we've got this, and essentially we want to repeat this 2 more times. So all we have to do is just take this whole div right here, copy and paste this a couple more times. Brackets is great because it automatically formats. That's, by the way, that's one of the most difficult things I've always had teaching students to do, is understanding the importance of formatting. And a lot of these text editors do it for you now, so I gave up on that battle long ago. I just let the editor format it for you. And that's essentially what we did last week. These images by default are automatically responsive, which is great. So as I go through my various breakpoints, it actually automatically takes care of that image resizing for me. But as soon as I hit small or extra small, it takes care of all that for me. So that's nice having responsive images. Okay. So that's basically what we did last class. That's just a quick review. Oh, and then the one other thing that we talked about is that, like, we have all these different classes. Like here we have BTN, and we talked about the color system. We have another class here called BTN Primary, and there's a color coding system. I don't know where they have it here. Maybe it's under, we could probably just find it under button. So BS4 buttons. And the idea is that we have basic, which is going to be no color, primary, secondary is a little bit more muted. So if I were creating an OK cancel type dialog, this would be primary, and this thing that's a little bit more muted would be cancel. The idea is that it's just some user interface theory that most of the time people are going to click OK. So to make your site a little bit more user-friendly, you want to draw their eyes to that, and you want cancel to be a little bit more muted. But then there's other things, like if something was successful. So we have this actually another class here called alerts. These are those things that you see kind of pop up on your page. Like say, for example, you register a new user. If your registration was successful, you'd use this success class. If it didn't, if it was like unsuccessful, there was a database error, something weird happened that you couldn't actually register your user, you'd get danger. Warning is maybe like if you registered your user but the password was weak or something. You know, you can kind of get the idea. But that's all that is. And it's the same deal, is that you have your main class. In the other case, it was button. In this case, it's alert. And then you'd have like alert success or alert primary or whatever. Yeah. So you'll see these throughout Bootstrap. Like I mentioned before, there's just way too many of these various components to go through. So the ones I like to cover are button, because button just kind of gives you a taste of how components work. The grid system, because that needs its own explanation. Cards are another example of just like a component, but a slightly more involved component. And then navigation. Navigation is complicated enough that we need to talk about that on its own. Okay, so everyone's good on this so far? Everyone understands what's going on here. Even if you don't understand all the code, you could at least copy and paste and recreate it. And if you needed to make minor modifications, like say, for example, if I wanted to make, right now it's 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If I wanted to equally space all these out as quarters, you know, so 25%, 25%, 25%, 25%, what would I do? So first of all, obviously, if I want 4 things, I would just copy and paste this div. And then what's the other modification I'd have to make? Is it going to be?
Change the 4 to a 3.
Exactly, perfect. Okay, so just be able to make minor modifications like that. You're not going to have to memorize all this, but I do want you to be able to look at this, read through. These are pretty intuitively named, like card body, card title, card text, and just be able to make modifications as needed. So let's quickly talk about these things called utility classes, because you'll see these pop up. Okay, so it's under a weird spot. It's kind of near the bottom here. BS4 utilities. So for the most part, in all your various classes that you've taken where you've done CSS, anytime, let's say for example, you needed to specify margin or padding, you'd specify it in pixels or percentages or one of the main various units, which is great. You do maybe like style equals, and then I just want to add a little padding on the bottom, 15 padding bottom colon 15px. There's been this move in the industry. I don't know how I feel about it, but it's happening, so I guess I just have to accept it. Where they're moving to these things called utility classes. And rather than specifying pixel sizes, what they do is they make these classes where you've got a limited number of choices. And what they do is they hard code a number of pixels. So let's do that. So I'm under utilities. Okay, so let's go down to spacing. So it's like this kind of naming system that you have to put together. So these are classes, by the way. So this isn't going to be like your inline styles where I do style equals something. These are actually class names. And they're like automatically generated by Bootstrap. So if I want to do something with margin, what I do is M. And then I say, okay, if I'm dealing with margin top, I would do like MT. Or if I want to do margins on the left and right hand side, I would do MX for margin on the x-axis. And then you do a dash. And then you can see here that they give you a preset number of things. So if I don't want any margin on the left, I would do like ML-0. And then they give you some preset values here. So 4 pixels, 8 pixels, 16, and so forth. But you might say, well, what if I want 6 pixels? You're just going to have to deal with it. The reason that they do this, I understand the rationale behind it. It's because what was happening is that you'd see a lot of these sites with very, very inconsistent but very minor inconsistencies where somebody decided on their own, hey, this looks better with 6 pixels, And so what would happen is between each page, you'd have these very, very, like you'd go page to page, and you'd get these very, very minor little differences between each page where people could not agree on what's best. And so this kind of forces you into a much more limited set of choices. But it adds consistency that like across your site. Does that make sense? So you have fewer choices, but you essentially have consistency. Hey. Yeah, grab as many as you need. Okay. So it adds consistency. So rather than specifying the pixel values manually, you do like ML-2, and then you're forced to this 8 pixels right here. Again, I'm kind of on the edge. I don't know if I necessarily like it. The argument is that there's 2 ways of looking at this. Is that you can make your own class. Like remember we did before, like we'd create our card, and then we'd create everything that we wanted with the card, like our margins and padding and everything, and that became the card. And everyone was supposed to use that card. This is a little bit different. Rather than creating our own card class, what we do is that we take something existing and we just modify it. It's like this close to using our inline styles, where style equals something, and that's why I'm kind of a little bit on the edge about it. I do use it. It's becoming popular. I've seen some very, very high profile sites switch to this style of, they're called utility classes. So there must be something to it. To me, it seems like it would get unmanageable very quickly, but people claim it doesn't. So I use it on and off. So let's go ahead and try that with something here. Let's, rather than making a completely new example, we already have something that we can use it with. We have our border. And let's say, for example, we wanted to get rid of these borders. So what we could do is, using these utility classes, what we could do is that we could just say, okay, just set the border to 0. And I don't even think we have to actually specify border, because certain things already have it by default. So here I'm pretty sure we could just specify border 0. So let's go back to our card, and we've got our div card. This is for the grid system. And then here I'm saying, okay, by default card probably gave me the border, but what I want to do is I just want to set border to 0. And again, we're not doing style equals border colon 0 pixels. I'm just saying border 0. I'm going to come back here, and it's a little tough to see. Let me get rid of all these tools here. And you can actually see, compared to the other two, this border is actually gone. Or if I wanted to set it larger rather than smaller, I would do border 2. You can see this is a slightly larger border now. Or if I felt that I didn't like the padding here, I could set, so let's say padding on the left and right hand side, the X direction. I don't want any padding on the left and right hand direction. So padding, so P for padding, X for the X direction, I want that to be 0. You can see here it actually, these had padding by default. Now I've gotten rid of my padding. There's a slightly more, so these CSS frameworks, there's just been an explosion of them lately. There's a huge amount of them. There's Google released a set of guidelines for making user interfaces called material design. Has anybody heard of this before?
The what?
Material design. It's kind of they spend a lot of time and effort into user interface research, and they released all these design guidelines on how to make good user interfaces. And what people have started to do was, because implementing it from scratch is so difficult, people have started to make various libraries. So if you want to use material design, there's a CSS library called like Material. There's one that's a little bit simpler called Tailwind that I've used that's pretty decent. But there's a huge number of these, and pretty much across the board, these have started to really move to these utility classes. So there must be something to them. I must just be getting old that I just don't get it. Has anybody seen that show Silicon Valley? There was one of their investors was like, they were talking about Slack, and they're just like, I don't get it. I just don't get it. I just must be too old. I just don't understand Slack. That's how I feel about these utility classes. But anyway, they're very popular, so I just wanted to show you at least how they worked. So I'm going to get rid of this, but you're welcome to use these utility classes as needed in your assignment. I just wanted to let you know how they worked. The other thing is that in Bootstrap 4, so the original versions of Bootstrap, Flexbox wasn't really around. Or if it was around, it was like in very early stages where very few browsers actually supported it. What's cool about the versions of Bootstrap now is that many of the classes, like container, I'm pretty sure uses Flexbox. And so rather than having to, let me find a good example. Okay, so justify content. If I've got something that I want to justify the content, all I have to do is say, okay, D for display, flex, justify content start. And again, these are class names, so somebody's already gone to the effort to take care of all this. To me, again, I don't know if this is necessarily any easier than specifying Flexbox manually, but it can be convenient. Like container is already flexed, I'm pretty sure. So if you've got a container and you want it to be centered, all you have to do is justify content center, and then that container automatically centers the content. So it's pretty useful. But these things are called utility classes. You'll see them pop up throw out. Okay. Hey, we have a huge number of components to work with, but let's go ahead and skip over to navigation now. I think we can actually accomplish all this in just one single example. So to make your life easier, I'm just, rather than having to go through that whole process of starting a new file and stuff, let's see if we can cheat a little bit here. Okay. So now let's do navigation. So navigation is obviously going to go at the top of your page. So go ahead and give yourself a little bit of room for navigation. Now again, the navigation tends to be very, very verbose. You can do a lot of things with it. It's also very flexible. But the one cool thing is, by default, you're automatically going to get that little, it's called the hamburger, that show hide, where you can actually have your menu work on mobile devices. So that's very cool. That's one thing that, using our old techniques, would have been a little bit tough. I did see some people did the show hide with JavaScript, and you probably realize it's not that tough. But if you just hate JavaScript and you just want to have nothing to do with it, Bootstrap keeps you from at least having to do that. Okay, so let's scroll over to navigation. Okay, so this one here called Navs, this kind of breaks it down into, so you can have vertical navigations, you can have tabs. You can already actually see here, remember I already talked about how it uses Flexbox, so all you have to do is set it to flex column rather than flex row. Lots of different things we can do. And some of you may go into this level of detail with your assignment. But let's just jump into the nav bar because this kind of knocks out two things at once. Okay, so the basic idea is that we've got a navigation, and we set the class to navbar. And we have some other options here. So if we want a light background, we just do BG light. If we wanted to expand at, so what that means is essentially, remember, you know how mobile devices, it kind of collapses it down? That has to do with the expansion. So it's saying expanded at small. So this whole thing contains the entire nav bar, but remember I just told you before we have this actual navigation, and so we apply that to the unordered list, and then these are individual items. So let's just click the try it yourself just to save a little bit of time. You hopefully can see how that works. Is that we've got this whole thing is the nav bar. And let's just say, for example, we want the background to be, instead of light, we want it to be dark. Just change it to BG dark. You might want to change your link colors as well. That's fine. And then this right here is the actual navigation, not the bar itself, but the nav part of it. And then these are the individual items in here. So it should be fairly obvious. If I wanted to add another, all I'd have to do, is just copy, paste, add, and then we've got our fourth link. Pretty self-explanatory, okay? Again, lots of copy, paste, modify. Like I said before, remember a lot of this stuff is flexed already for you. It already set that display flex property for you. So if we wanted to center it, we would just do justify content center. You can see right here. We have background primary, so we can change the colors and all that stuff. What I want to get to is the first thing. So right here, having a brand or some sort of logo. So let's go ahead and click try it yourself for that. Okay, so we've got the main navigation, and here what they did is that they had a class called navbar brand. Essentially, that's like your logo. That can either be an image or text. On your assignment, I don't particularly care. If you want to take the time to actually make an image, that's fine. But that class is called navbar brand. And then we just go back into our links as usual. Now, what if we wanted to push this over to the right-hand side? So have our logo on the left and our links on the right. There's a couple ways I think we can do this. I didn't try this before class, but I'm pretty sure we can do margin left and set that to auto. Let's see if that works. Okay. I guess that's why these utility classes can be convenient, because just by putting inside of the links, I said margin left auto, it set that auto property, or that it set the margin left property to auto, and then all the extra margin it just filled up. So now we can have like a left and right hand side. So now let's get into a real world example here. Let's do the one that there's one here that collapses. Let me see if I can find it. Because there's some extra special code that you have to add for it to collapse. Okay, yeah. So go to this section that says collapsing the navigation bar. So the examples that we've seen so far don't work nicely on mobile. They'll just keep on going smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. But eventually you want this thing right here where we can press it and get our navigation. So let's go ahead and copy and paste that right into our example that we've been working on today. And let's go through this. I realize there's a lot here, but if you go through and read it, it turns out it's actually not that much. So just like before, we're saying, okay, this is going to be our main nav bar. It's going to be the navigation bar across the top of our site. The background's going to be dark, and the actual navigation bar itself is going to be dark. And you can contrast that however you want. Now there's probably, we haven't really talked about this, probably something interesting that says navbar expand. And I'm pretty sure that just, I think that's related to the collapsing. I think it just expands it to the full. I'm just going to quickly remove it just to see what it does. Oops. So it's saying at medium, expand it. Let's get rid of that and see what that does. Ah, okay, yeah, exactly. So notice right here, this isn't really working correctly anymore. That's what that did, is that had to do with Control Z. So navbar expand at medium, that just had to do with expanding it from the hamburger icon. So that was kind of a responsive thing in the mobile devices. We've already seen this right here, the brand. This is new. This is that button to collapse or expand our menu. And this really only is going to show up when we're on small devices. Because right here it's saying medium and larger. I want it to be expanded. And then once we get to our smaller devices, this button's going to show up and work properly. It's just kind of some magic that happens in the background with some JavaScript. But then this is the part you care about. This is just the plain old navigation links. And we've done this in class before, okay? But now we're just setting some extra stuff up here. We're just saying, I want this to be collapsible. Again, this is just a responsive thing. But then we go here to our navbar nav, and then we've just got a bunch of items. This should be pretty obvious to most people. In here, we've got our navigation and our links, but it doesn't quite really line up necessarily. So some of you might just say, okay, I like the way this looks, but what do you think we could do if we wanted to line this up kind of with our grid here? What class could we use? Starts with a C. We could use our container. And we have to be a little bit careful about how we use this. So what we want to do is just after nav, because the nav bar is gonna be all this stuff right here. So don't add this, but I just want to show you what happens. What I could do is I could be lazy about it, and I could just say div class is equal to container. And so what do you think this is going to do? What's it going to look like? That background, that gray background, is that going to be the full width of the page? No, because I've set that container around the whole thing. And so we're going to end up with this, which may be fine for your site if that's what you want. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. So what we want to do instead is that we want to put that container just after that, because that nav bar is what kind of handles that background. And then all this stuff is the inner text. And so we just have to switch it here. And then now what that does is it says, okay, I want that navigation bar to expand the full width of the page, but the actual stuff on the inside, put that inside of a container. This is a very common thing, is if you want a full width background, but the stuff on the inside of a container, that's what you do, is that you just, the outer class, you just let expand as needed, but then that inner class, we wrap inside of a container. And let's just make sure that it still is responsive. It's working, and then there we go. Once we get to our smaller devices, we get this button right here. Great. And let's pick a device specifically. So let's see what it looked like. Okay. I'm gonna have to refresh. There we go. So we're getting there. There's one last thing that we might want to look into. Is drop-down menus. Because it's not that uncommon to have a drop-down menu on your site. Like here they have a more button, and this one's a little bit more complicated than we're going to get into, but so to have a drop-down, scroll down to where it says drop-down, and for our list item, what we do is that we have a special class called Dropdown Menu, and then we have Dropdown Item. And so let's go ahead and copy and paste that dropdown into our code. So just after, so we've got our navbar links, and we still want it to be inside of the unordered list, so I'm going to go ahead and put it right here. It's going to be the last list item that we have. To responsive. And so now here we've got our drop-down link, which works, which is great. And then let's see how, or if it even works, once we get to this menu right here. And it still works. You might want to adjust this with some utility classes, this background, but you kind of get the idea. So this is going to kind of be the basis for your assignment, is that I want you to have some sort of navigation at the top. It doesn't have to actually go anywhere. It doesn't have to be like a multi-page site. Single page site is fine. These can go nowhere. Don't just have it say generic stuff where it just says like link, you know. Try to come up with some sort of like mental, almost like a theme, like you're like, okay, I'm going to use this to promote my art. Or I'm making this for a small business that does construction, or I'm making this for a coffee shop, you know, sort of like just try not to be overly generic with it like we've done in class. I've kind of set you up with the tools, but I want you to take that next step and say, okay, these tools that we learned in class, how would I take that to the next step and actually make a real website? Maybe even not use lorem ipsum images. Maybe come up with your own images that actually fit whatever your site is. Maybe even explore a little bit. There's this thing called Jumbotron that's kind of popular. It's just basically a very large piece of text at the top of your page. So maybe some of you could use that somehow. They just have a huge number of components here. And again, most of these are pretty much copy and paste. What else might somebody want to use? Oh, has anybody seen these before? Carousels?
Yeah.
You might want to put a carousel at the top of your page. That might be an interesting to put. Okay. So just get creative with it. Don't just like do the bare minimum. Bare minimum, even if you satisfy all the requirements, that might get you a low A. I kind of that last little bit of going from like a 93 to 100%. I just kind of look at, okay, did this person put some effort into it, or did they just do the most generic class example where it says link 1, link 2? Did they, that sort of stuff, okay? Now the extra stuff that we didn't go over in class, that's a part of the assignment. You're going to have to add a footer, which isn't terribly difficult. It's in there somewhere. If not on W3schools, it's going to be on the main site. I guess I don't have it here, but to be perfectly honest, most of the time you can just make sure to specify the version, by the way, too. There's older versions of Bootstrap. Don't use this right here. This is empty. This is that material design that I was telling you about before. Don't get confused by this. This is Google's user interface. Okay. But this one right here looks pretty good. Examples, Bootstrap. It should have a footer in here somewhere. Yeah, so this one says that it claims to have a footer. So you could go in here and then view the page source and then come up with a footer. It's fairly simple. It's like you just go all the way down until you see a footer. I see a footer. I'm going to copy and paste this into my code and then modify it to make it look a little bit better. So you're going to have to add your own footer. And then the other thing I want you to do is something like this, where you've got it taking up 2/3, 1/3. So just to let you know, it's not always going to be evenly spaced. And to me, the way this is going to collapse is I would say give this its own row. So don't try to put it in with the rest of these. Like this and this would be separate rows. And then just have one breakpoint, like at medium, and then so at smaller than medium, so extra small and small, just have it collapse down to 1. Don't try to get overly fancy with it. I think they got a little bit fancy with it on the actual Audubon Society site. I think it splits 50-50 at some point. Nope, I guess not. Yeah. So they got a little bit fancy with it. They split it 50-50. I'm not even looking for that. You can just go from 2/3, 1/3 to just down to a single column. I'm okay with that. Okay. So again, you have a little bit more than a week. If it turns out that like you're really struggling and you need even a little bit more time, I might, on a case-by-case basis, give you some more time. But this shouldn't take too long again because it's a lot of copy-paste modify. Okay, so I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover for today. Any questions? So this right here, this example that we did today, as usual, I'll post this to Blackboard. This will serve as your starting point. Okay, we've got a navigation here. We've got our grid system set up. We've got some cards. We've got breakpoints. We've got all the basics. Now I want you to take these basics, this very generic site, and I just want you to turn it into something a little bit more like a real world site. And again, try to pick some sort of purpose. Like again, promoting your art, a coffee shop, whatever, bowling alley, who cares? Okay. Any questions on the assignment or any technical stuff on Bootstrap? Okay. And as always, email me if anything comes up, but I think that's pretty much it for today. So if there's nothing else, I will see everybody next week. And good luck starting your assignment. And just email me if you have any questions at all.